A very warm greeting to everyone. Wonderful to see so many people come to this important webinar today. My name is Hilligje, and I'm the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities. I will explain in a minute who we are, but I wanted first to also have a warm welcome to the speakers of today, in particular Stephen Sterling, and I will introduce him in a minute. And then respondents, Elena, Toukan, Iveta, Silova, and Arjen Wals, who will be with us. We also wanted to have students coming to this session and speak, but we hope there are many in the chat who will be able to also interact with the presentations that will be made today. And we will have a second such webinar focusing on all the different stakeholders in higher education to engage with this kind of work. So this webinar is focusing on rethinking education for a more sustainable future. It's a conversation about the values that come into play when we think about rethinking education. We will be talking about transformation, what it means actually, and what is needed to make transformation a reality. And we will talk about all of this in the context of the broader agenda on education for sustainable development, which is an agenda that has a very long history, also at the IAU. So this conversation is also to be placed in the context of an overall sequencing of events. The World Higher Education Conference, which took place for the third time 2 years ago, and which focused really also on this transformative power of education and higher education in particular, yet did not come with the exact answers that many were expecting. Where do we go? Yet there is a roadmap that came out of it that is of interest, and also one of the backdrops to the conversations we will have. The UNESCO ESD-Net work that is being done around education for sustainable development, which is a continuation of much of the work that was done way back in the past, also on environmental education or engagement with environmental dynamics. And education for sustainable development is a much broader concept that we cherish a lot, especially also at the IAU. And then as another backdrop is the United Nations Agenda 2030, transforming our world. And all of that resonates, you will see in the presentations that we will hear today. So this is a bit of where we stand when it comes to this webinar. This webinar is also part of a longer continuum. We started with the IAU Webinar Series when COVID hit. That was our initial response to COVID, and an opportunity for the global higher education community to stay connected beyond divides and against all odds, if I may say so. And we initiated initially conversations about what were universities to do in the context of COVID. And it soon became a really nice and very powerful tool to bring speakers from around the world together who would not necessarily have the time to travel to places and take part in conversations, but bring many, many voices from around the world together to envisage a new place for higher education in the context of the pandemic then, and since then also very often in the context of these global agendas that are that I just mentioned earlier, and as well in the context of all the geopolitical challenges that higher education faces, while higher education at the same time is invited to be the key stakeholder to a transformation much needed if we want to move into a more sustainable future. So much information there, and then you would ask yourselves, what is then the IAU? Who are we? So we have two quick slides here for broader information for those who do not necessarily know us yet, and a refresher for those who know. We're a global non-governmental organization called into life by UNESCO back in 1950. when the IAU documents were signed in Nice, and they brought together many universities from around the world to think about the role of higher education in a world totally disrupted by two world wars. And we hoped that bringing these global voices of higher education together would help prevent wars and build peace in the minds of people along the tagline of UNESCO. We see today that there's still too many wars and increasing war zones in this world, and higher education has to step up its action there as well. We're still based at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, in France, but we work globally. We have a membership of around 600 members. I just had to prepare a report for our board coming up, and so we are at 610 members exactly, composed of higher education institutions, organizations working in the field of higher education, affiliates, organizations that are governmental and are interested in also dialoguing with the membership to define the future of higher education and how it can contribute to society. And our members are based in some 120 countries around the world. We also reach out through our Global World Higher Education database, also known as the WED.net. We reach out to 20,000 higher education institutions around the world, a database in which we map the higher education systems to make them more transparent to the global higher education community. And we map information on higher education institutions that are accredited in their countries and are public or private, but not for profit. Because the landscape of higher education is much larger, and obviously in the kind of work that we will be engaging with today, sustainable development, also the for-profit higher education institutions should be involved in the conversations at large. So we do a lot of work on internationalization, on leadership, on sustainable development, on the digital transformation of higher education to connect with these broader issues that we are working on. And we do a lot of advocacy for the sector at government level and also to the UN, and in particular to UNESCO. How do we do that? We do that through research, publications, monitoring, and networking. And the networking is what we hope to emphasize also here today with the speakers who have graciously accepted to come to the fore and work with us. So the next slide, please, is one where you will see how we engage more specifically with higher education and research for sustainable development, a work that started and was initiated some 30 years back with the adoption of the Brundtland report, more focusing on environmental education. And we've moved and followed the broader global agendas to also engage very strongly more recently since 2015 with the UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, where we've invited universities from around the world to champion work on the different SDGs while connecting between SDGs. So we have 16 sub-hubs of higher education institutions networking around the world. A university based in Colombia was invited to immediately identify 5 colleagues from the other 5 continents to network around the issues of SDG 2, no hunger, and it's similar around the world. So it was really a huge global puzzle, very interesting to see who would work with who, why, and how. And that's also part of this transformative dynamic that we hope to help support through this higher education for sustainable development global portal and hub, and through the different kinds of activities that we undertake. So we also have an IAU HESD portal where you will find all kinds of information that will help you get started on SD if you want to get started, or to even post your own activities in order for others to find you, network, and work together. So we can go to the next slide. And let me please introduce a little exercise that we have here, because we would like to have your input right from the start. We have imagined 2 questions to get your input. So if you can access the Mentimeter, please do scan the QR code that you see on the screen. You can use the code then to connect. And now we get to the questions. So I hope you had sufficient time to look at your phone, open it up, and try and connect to the QR code. So we imagined 2 questions that could help inform the conversation also at a later stage. So please go to the next slide, Isabel, and then the questions are the following, and you will see them on the screen. The first question is, what to you are key challenges for transforming higher education? A huge question, of course, but you may have an idea of what you would like to share. So we look forward to hearing what you think about these questions. What are key challenges for transforming higher education? The second question is, what kind of solutions or actions would you believe would be needed to actually move higher education to transform? And what could be solutions and actions to take in order to trigger the transformation that is needed? That is the second question. So we see that some people are responding in the chat. That's perfectly fine. We will pick up on those as well. If you cannot access the Mentimeter, please use the chat. That will help us also inform these 2 questions. So thank you for taking part in that initial initiative before we now move to the core of the webinar here today, where I'm extremely pleased to and honored to introduce to you Professor Stephen Sterling, with whom I've had the pleasure to work for over 20 years already on issues pertaining to the broader issue of education for sustainable development. Stephen Sterling is an incredibly inspiring researcher and actor in the field, and he has a track record of over 40 years of engagement in environmental and sustainable education. He really has moved himself to the position of thought leader, not only in the UK or in Europe, but certainly also at the global level. And he has engaged in many, many conversations, looking with colleagues, with staff and with students at what does it take to actually transform education for a better future. And he has summarized that work in a very interesting book that we obviously invite you to access, a book called Learning and Sustainability in Dangerous Times. And that will be also part of his presentation, because he offers to discuss how to repurpose higher education in dangerous times, and offers to look at key elements and 10 key elements to transformation, and how that could translate also into action on your own campuses and in your own work. So he's really looking at how should and how can education and learning be rethought. How can it be reconfigured? And what does that take in order for education to become even more significant, purposeful, and central to the contributions to achieving a more sustainable and just world? What does education do? Does education make a difference? Should it make a difference still? Can it make a difference? Why, how, and to what end? Also here, when we consider the developments of the higher education sectors in countries, we see that education is tasked with many, many different things. And that's also where Elena, Toukan, Arjen Wals, and Iveta Silova will also come in. But can education actually really deliver on those questions that they are exposed to? And can they really deliver on the promise that education holds in a time, in these dangerous times, when we see that governments actually disengage from education rather than supporting it? Very recently, there was the Summit of the Future with the adoption of the Pact of the Future. And there we see already that even if at these global organizations, education is considered as highly essential when thinking about the future, education was not even mentioned in the documents, which is quite amazing. So we will have an opportunity to discuss these dimensions, also listening to the reactions from Elena, Dr. Elena Toukan, who's a researcher at UNESCO, and in particular for the UNESCO Futures of Education initiative. She's been working in particular on renewing the social contract for education, and has supported the work of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, developed by UNESCO under the auspices of Her Excellency Madame Saleh Work-Sudze from Ethiopia. IAU was very pleased to be part of the discussions and the development of these initiatives, and continues to support the Futures of Education initiative. So we thank you, Elena Toukan, for being with us. The second respondent will be Professor Arjen Wals, who is professor at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. He's professor of transformative learning for socio-ecological sustainability, also chairholder of the UNESCO Chair of Social Learning and Sustainable Development. He's worked many years on transformative learning for socio-ecological sustainability, engaged in many initiatives and design thinking initiatives to rethink learning processes and learning spaces for people to engage with sustainability. So it will be very interesting to hear your reaction, Professor Arjen Wals. And last but not least, we welcome Professor Iveta Silova, who's Associate Dean of Global Engagement and Professor at Teacher College MLF at Arizona State University. And we're very pleased to welcome you also as a researcher on the global futures of scholarly engagement and globalization. You work a lot on decolonization, on the transformation of education. The link also is very strong to comparative education dynamics. And you've been involved quite a bit in the Summit of the Future, so your feedback there will be interesting as well. So 3 excellent respondents to a presentation that I would like to invite Professor Stephen Sterling to start.
Thank you, Hilligje, and greetings, everybody. I'll just bring my slides up. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Hilligje. You only got one thing wrong, which is, sadly, I have to report I've been working in this area for 50 years, rather than 40, which is a scary thought, but there we are. Yeah, so thank you to you and to IAU for hosting this webinar, and thank you to Arjen, Iveta, and Elena, who've agreed to be part of the event. So yeah, to get straight in, I've been working in this area of environmental sustainability all this time. First as a classroom teacher, then as a director of an NGO promoting environmental education, and lastly in academia, the last 12 years of which was at the University of Plymouth, where I was head of education for sustainability, and we tried to make sustainability a key part of the university's policy, practice, and identity. So in all that time in my career, I've been observing and involved in the course of environmental and sustainability education and its evolution and its influence, but I've also had a keen interest in major trajectories and trends in socio-ecological issues. So against this context, I've always been concerned with how far education as a whole, and universities in particular, are responding to global issues and crises. And I have to say, I've been more or less perplexed as to why education has not responded proportionately to these huge issues which will affect the lives of those who are being educated. And also more seriously, I've been questioning how far and how why education has too often been more of a contributory rather than a remedial influence in the generation and growth of these systemic issues. So My argument is that, well, notwithstanding pockets of excellence in innovation, which are growing in number, and I don't want to belittle or disparage that really good work in any way, but overall, higher education is not yet sufficiently aligned to the realities of complexity, instability, and unsustainability, and the need for a rapid socio-economic transition towards a livable and safer planet and world. So there's a critical time lag, and yet the need for societal transformation is urgent. I think we only have to look at the news to recognize that. So the world's becoming more dangerous and the future more compromised. And I don't need to quote stats and evidence to back this up. I'm sure everybody on this webinar knows this, and young people know this too. So this is why I wrote my new book, to take stock, reflect on what's stopping us responding fully, and offer some thoughts on how we might move forward decisively. And this presentation is partly based on the book and partly on a new paper which I've just written, which is at the bottom of that slide. Now, the book is informed by a question here. This is the question I've been asking myself and asking many others for years, and it's only become more relevant with the passing of the years. So how can education and learning be rethought and reconfigured to make a significant and central contribution to achieving a more sustainable and just world? So for a long time, I thought that question was enough, but over time, I thought it needed to be reframed at a deeper level, and I hope it'll become clear why I thought that in a minute. So this second reiteration of this question looks like this. What is the nature of consciousness that appears necessary to achieving a safe, more ecologically sustainable and livable society, which can both survive and thrive? What changes may be required in the way we view and practice education and learning if they are to contribute fundamentally to such a change of consciousness? So there's a critique implied in this formulation, which is that the dominant worldview, the way of thinking in society, the consciousness thereof is problematic to the extent that it's maladapted to the world as we now find it. And this cultural worldview permeates how we see and conduct education. So instead, we need something which is more holistic, more ecological, more systemic, an epistemic consciousness, if you like, a relational consciousness. Some people talk about a planetary consciousness. And I think this is emerging in society in response to the global crises. There's evidence that the social learning process is beginning to take hold in some quarters at least. But how far is HE contributing to this shift of worldview? So here's a question for higher education. How can universities urgently transform their ethos, policies and practices to function in service of the survival and well-being of humanity and the planet at a time of growing instability and existential threat? That's a quote from a paper I've listed there. So as I've suggested, there seems to be an element of inertia and lock-in and non-learning operating here, even as the encompassing conditions of complexity and uncertainty and unsustainability become ever more evident in society. That's not to say, of course, there's not been a lot of very good work going on for years, really, 20 or 30 years, spearheaded by UNESCO and involving many stakeholders, including IAU. And notably, you'll probably know that the UNESCO commissioned the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which reported in 2021, which is an interesting report, which is still current in UNESCO's work. And I draw your attention to the second sentence in black. Education systems often reproduce and perpetuate the very conditions that threaten our shared futures, limiting education's potential to be truly transformative. So that's quite a criticism. So this is the acute paradox now facing us, I think. So education is increasingly seen as critical to the possibility of securing a livable future. Yet at the same time, this depends on the transformation of education, which is, however, deeply rooted in the current social order and culture. So we have a problem on our hands in that respect. The dialogue goes on, the discussion goes on as it should. The next international event, which is part of the Futures of Education initiative, is in December. And the concept note for this event coming up in December notes that we face an existential choice between continuing on an unsustainable path or radically changing course. Well, a lot of people are saying this. And then it says education is crucial to this change of course, yet education itself must be transformed. So again, we're back with this issue. What do we do with this paradox? We've just had the Summit of the Future, as Hilligje mentioned. And this is a quote from the UNEP submission just a few weeks ago. As environmental, technological, and societal change join forces to disrupt human, planetary, and economic health, we must not just prepare for the future, we must shape it. So surely education has to step up and be part of this shaping. This is an urgent task. We've already crossed nearly 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries, which constitute a safe operating space for humanity. So it seems to me we have a critical challenge on our hands. When I was writing the book, I began mapping what I think are the main blocks, or perhaps locks, preventing or constraining mainstream education from responding fully. So in the few minutes I have, I'm going to quickly go through what I'm calling 10 locks and 10 possible keys that might affect necessary change. It's stated very simply and concisely to accentuate the message. You may not agree with them, you might find them provocative, you may have better ideas than me, you might have additional ideas that I've missed out, I haven't thought of, but what I'm trying to do here is stimulate thought and discussion and action so we can realize an education that takes us towards a preferable future. So the keys are kind of like opening doors, maybe, but they're not strategies. That would have to be another discussion, I think. So starting with issue 1. So certain futures, which I've just alluded to. I think the slide is self-explanatory. And I get to one of my bugbears straight away, if you like. So if you look at the majority of higher education courses, research, symposia, conferences, and so, you would never know that we are faced by a tightening polycrisis, to use that term, which is now current, that will affect the lives and prospects of all graduates. You know, they seem to be in another, or perhaps on another planet, I don't know, but not taking due account of this one. I think part of the issue is the scope of higher education in the last 3 decades has been suffering from a narrowing that has been considerably aggravated by the utilitarian neoliberal effects of marketization and commodification of the sector, and the erosion of higher education as a public and common good, while the ethical norms of the university have become subsumed in serving the economy and growth. So I think the challenge here is to go the other way, an extension of vision involving conscious repurposing and expanding the system of concern to take full account of context of the current precarious state of the world and of planetary limits and future scenarios and prospects and possibilities and so on. Okay, next slide, next issue. So the second issue is we seem to be locked into the reductionist and instrumental and managerial paradigm based upon a metaphorical, mechanistic episteme and ontology. It's still operative and it's still dominant. So I've argued for some years, and this is elaborated in the book in some length, that educational institutions need to move towards a more life-affirming ecological paradigm informing purpose, policy, and practice. Our reductionist habits of thought are are apparent in the way we organize silos in HE and our conceptual boundaries, which is the next issue, boundaries. So labels and boundaries, the limits and constraints of labels and boundaries. So we have problems with people, for example, arguing between education for change movements and defending their own turf, whether it's environmental education or educational sustainability or global citizenship education or peace education. This sort of jostling between education for change movements is really unhelpful. And then, of course, disciplines tend to defend their own territories. And then there's also a boundary between the institution and its community. So if we want to be imaginative and visionary, we need to be brave enough to get out of intellectual, academic, and institutional boxes and instead embrace and explore uncertainty, contingency, connectivity, and so on through agility and adaptability. So this is a challenge to the way we organize things currently. I'm not saying this more dynamic response doesn't take place. It's just that it's not sufficiently widespread. Next. So the next one of the 10 issues is instrumentalism. This is a plea neither to see education primarily as a means of saving the earth without proper regard to the learning process, or see education as entirely a developmental matter and end in itself without urgent regard to socio-economic, ecological context and outcomes. So this split between the instrumental view and the developmental view of education has damaged the effectiveness of ESD and education change movements. But transformative learning and education, I think properly considered, brings both perspectives into a greater and necessary whole. And this brings us to issue 5. This is all you can tell. All this is kind of shorthand and begs an awful lot of unpacking and discussion, but maybe that's down the line. I'm just trying to get the essences of some key ideas across here. So, transformation misconstrued. Well, we know that the idea of transforming education is quite current. It has been for some years, spearheaded by UNESCO and the International Commission. But to me, I think it often lacks the depth of meaning which the word implies. Their use lacks that depth. So you know, why do we need transformative education? And what's maladaptive or wrong about mainstream such that we need transformation? And why would that be the case? What's the depth and breadth of transformation which is necessary? And thirdly, how is this to be nurtured, and on the basis of what principles, what values, what philosophy? So none of this is very clear too often. So unless we get to these deeper questions, I think we won't make an awful lot of progress, despite the rhetoric often sounding pretty good on the surface. So next issue. This is the whole thing about how a university and institution responds to the sustainability agenda. And for years, the response has been one of incorporation or accommodation into some parts of the curriculum. The language used to describe this add-on approach has typically been embedding sustainability, which is fine, it's better than nothing, and can be the first step in a learning journey towards deeper institutional change. Or it can be isolated and effectively neutralized so that the ESD that takes place is conformative rather than reformative, let alone transformative. So I argue that rather the sustainability stroke unsustainability agenda needs to be seen as a challenge for the whole institution. Okay, 7th issue coming up. So this is another one which has become apparent to me over the years, really, and it's really to do with UNESCO. And I take my hat off to UNESCO. We'd been an awful lot further behind if it hadn't existed or hadn't done this work. It's done a tremendous job. but that's no reason not to be critical of some of the work and that it's doing or has done. And this applies to this particular issue. So for years, UNESCO's talked about the need for a new vision for education as a whole, and at the same time put a good deal of work into promoting ESD. Well, fine, but it's debatable whether you can have both of those goals at once. Are they complementary or are they actually counterproductive? Is the emphasis on ESD deflecting attention from the need to transform education as a whole? And I think it could be sometimes. So I'll leave that one with you. So my view is that ESD needs to be an agent of deeper change and not be contained in itself, and that's that, so to speak. Okay, so the 8th issue, the individualistic focused, the traditional focus in educational policy and programs, as we all know, has long been on the individual learner rather than the collective. And now the whole neoliberal paradigm, if you like, has tended to squash the older liberal and progressive values which were in the ascendancy when I trained many years ago. So these values such as empathy and cooperation and mutuality have been squashed by the dominance of neoliberal values stressing narrow individualism and competition and metrics and testing. More widely, the neoliberal view of the world tends to shift the blame for sustainability issues onto individuals rather than recognize the critical role of the corporate and government world. So arguably, this has influenced much ESD to concentrate on values, individual behaviors, which is well-meaning and can be valuable, but it attracts or can deflect attention from structural causes of unsustainable lifestyles. It's that one. And then the 9th issue, the development model. So I'm letting you read these rather than reading them, but I think I'll read this one. Recognize that the dominant development model based on endless material growth and extraction is having a catastrophic degenerative effect on people, communities, and planet. Well, that might have been pretty controversial a few years ago, but I know there's almost headlines every day indicating that this is what's happening. And it's serious, of course. There's research papers coming out all the time, noting the systemic issues of which are really concerning. So I think this begs education really to be involved in critique of factors which are leading to degenerative development or diseconomic growth, which is a term Herman Daly used, where the benefits to some are outweighed by the cost to many, or nature. So secondly, I think this is about exploring alternatives and growth in well-being rather than material growth. So alternatives are such things as human-scale development and eco-development and post-growth economics and so on. So I think we need to critique sustainable development where it's becoming meaningless or co-opted and compromised, rather than just take it on board without looking at it critically. Okay, and then the very last slide, I know it's been a bit of a gallop, I hope not too indigestible, is purpose and the Great Leap. So in my book, I argue that the direction and effort and purpose of education needs to be aligned urgently towards achieving a safe future as far as that is possible. What Cristina Figueres calls the future we must create. So as we know, there's a time lag between rapid socio-ecological change and the ability of universities to respond quickly and appropriately. But I think if we're stepping back, I think global society is in the transition, critical transition from what you might call the old story of unlimited economic growth, globalization, increasing inequality, individualism, and environmental decline, and struggling to assert a new story, which is regenerative and life-affirming, with sufficiency and well-being of people and environment at its core, appropriate to the age we find ourselves living in. So I think this poses a deep challenge to the purpose of education. Can we break through to a more stable world or suffer some kind of breakdown this century? And scientists are now talking about possible social breakdown at some point. So we need to do, in education, we need to do something about this and fast. And it is a learning challenge across society, which societal change, which formal education has to be part of, in my view. I think in education, second order, let's say, and third order learning is taking place within universities communities, where increasing numbers of academics and professional staffs and students are seeking change, aware that the future is under threat. But is this movement deep enough, broad enough, widely taking place? I don't know. So just to explain this term, the Great Leap or the Great Transition, a number of people and researchers use different phrases to explain this, really, and the stages of what might take us to a safer future have been mapped out by various researchers. The Great Leap comes from a Club of Rome book. I don't quite remember the name. Never mind. The Great Transition concept comes from the Great Transition Initiative, which you can look up. So lastly, I think the two challenges in a nutshell are education having a critique role, but also a constructive role in trying to build, if you like, a safer society into the future. So there's my thoughts for what they're worth. If you're interested, my website's down on the left-hand side, and I hope that hasn't been too much of a breathless gallop and makes some sense to you. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for these thought-provoking ideas. 10 locks, 10 keys. I would like to give the floor to our respondents. Elena, Toukan first, Professor Arjen Wals next, and then Professor Iveta Silova as a third respondent. So Dr. Elena Toukan, if you would like to take maybe 5 minutes to react to this, and then in the conversation I will have a few questions that you will be able to reflect on together with Stephen Sterling. So Elena, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and just wonderful to hear the synthesis of Professor Sterling's very timely book and his work to engage with these topics that I think are really on everybody's minds, and we are, I think, are really in need of these kinds of analyses and these frameworks that can help us find different entry points into the different locks and keys in Professor Sterling's framework and words, where we can actually collaboratively and in this relational approach, act and take steps in these directions. I have a couple of points that I just wanted to kind of connections and links that I wanted to make to the Futures of Education report that Professor Sterling mentioned early on. But I wanted to start actually with a personal reflection that came to mind when I was reading some of his work and in other recent conversations about why it is that simply expanding the model of education and access to education alone, as important as it is, that alone will not transform education and make it fit for purpose in the way that it needs to be to address the present circumstances. So A number of years ago, I was visiting a school in a few schools in the Copper Belt region of Zambia. And this was a region where there had been a big focus on expanding access to education. So I was with some teachers, I was sitting in a grade 5 class in a primary school, and I noticed on the board a lesson that was from the Zambia national curriculum about all the benefits of the mining industry for Zambia's economy. And it listed only benefits with actually no drawbacks in that particular lesson. And as I was passing through the classroom, the students were painstakingly copying this lesson into their notebooks. Now, this was a town that was largely composed of populations that had been displaced from their homes and villages by foreign extraction and mining companies. And in this town, the soil had been so contaminated by lead that it was at that time recognized as the most toxic site on the planet. And this caused different neurological and developmental problems and delays. And so while the achievement of primary education was undoubtedly a profound accomplishment for the lives of the young people and the community as a whole, the paradox between what the students were learning and what they were living was extremely stark in that moment. And I've reflected on this in other instances in these kinds of discussions. So as Professor Sterling mentioned, and I think one of the strongest messages of the Futures of Education report of the International Commission is this critique of the development model that has brought humanity to this point where we're facing such precarity both in terms of our human-to-human relations and our relationship to a single living planet on which we depend for our existence, and also in which many species are facing thresholds that they very soon may not be able to come back from, and that's something that humanity is responsible for through these elements of anthropocentrism, of individualism, of domination, of competition, all of these elements that characterize this model. And the Futures of Education report levels this critique and also considers a reorientation of education with two core principles of what it describes and calls for as in a new social contract for education. And one of these principles is to strengthen education as a human right across life and throughout all different times and spaces in life. So learning societies, as well as the dedicated institutions and times and spaces of education that we see. And also seeing education as a public endeavor and a common good that belongs to and reflects the diversity of humanity's many different ways of knowing, living, and being, and protects education from the enclosures of and distortions of profiteering. So these are two core principles that I would suggest that we can really hold as a central redirection in our response and critique to this development model. Another aspect of the transformation of education's role in changing course, and I think this is a really powerful question that Professor Sterling raised at the beginning of why has education been so slow to respond to the context. And one reason that we've seen is that really we have to think about education and transformation as a two-way street in many regards. So yes, on the one hand, education has a role to play, but it's also very deeply affected by the context around it. So we see, for example, in zones of conflict, schools are no longer spaces of learning, they're spaces of shelter. When there's a hurricane, the same thing. We see as there's many technological advancements, they're not necessarily used for the best interest of students and teachers, but more as an opportunity for private companies to get more market share from, for example. So there's that direction, but then for education to really respond with equal force, if not greater force, to change direction, support is needed not only within the education sector and from the education sector, but in the different social and political and community contexts around it, including the international community, to give it the adequate degree of support that it requires. And finally, just a note on higher, yes, time is up. So maybe I'll save my comment about higher education, the report, for the discussion, but I will put a couple of links for those who are interested in following UNESCO's Future of Education, and also a recent special issue that we've released on renewing the special, the social contract for education that brings think pieces from different scholars and thinkers. So I'll put that in the chat and look forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elena. And I see there's much more to be shared, but let's first listen also to Arjen Wals, and then next to Iveta Silova, and then we get back to a conversation before giving the floor also to the questions that will be raised in the Q&R. So for those listening, and please do not hesitate to put your questions in the Q&R space of the Zoom. Arjen, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Hilligje. Yes, well, I'm not, I just, obviously, I really appreciate Stephen's 10 lock-ins and keys, and appreciate his mentorship for I wasn't there for the last 50 years like he was, but certainly the last 30, I've been benefiting from his thoughts. But not to repeat where the resonance is maybe, but rather to maybe add something. Maybe, I'm not sure if they're lock-ins or something else, but I would say that something that might be needs to be mentioned is as a lock-in, which you might call psychic numbing and the loss of natural intelligence, or NI. We talk a lot about AI, but there's a lot of distractions that come, and they are connected with the globalizing economy and the commodification of everything. But people are in a perpetual state of being distracted, and this is also true for our faculty and students, and how to overcome these distractions and have more attentive, meaningful connections with people, place, and other species is critical. The other one, another lock-in and maybe a key to solve it, is the loss of hope and the rise of despair among many. And also the loss of agency. So this is another important question, I think, for higher education: how to develop agency and to create more hopeful futures. And I think what we sometimes hear is that science is often, it's often said that science is ahead through innovation and continuous development of new models, concepts, and that the practice is kind of behind. But I like to turn it around. I think when it comes to sustainability, the practices in some ways are ahead of the science. There are lots of niches and practices in communities where there are attempts to go against the grain and to kind of disrupt these lock-ins already. And I think higher education needs to work with those practices and support those practices. I still think that we are, sometimes we talk about entanglement, and a lot of people in the room here that use that concept, that we are entangled in our everyday lives with everything, including future generations, the past, and also other species. But we're also enstrangled, and this is the system and the structure that holds us hostage in a way and makes it very hard to live more sustainable lives. So how to disrupt, how to kind of resist this entanglement, how to go against the grain. This is also important for higher education, to develop what you might call disruptive capacity building. These lock-ins, sometimes there's no key and the lock needs to be broken. And that, I think, requires a bit more than looking for the key. So I'd like to also talk with Stephen maybe later about this. Where does the more radical, transgressive change come in, and what is the role of higher education? I also, we just finished a book, I'm not going to promote it, but it's about 50 years of learning and education for the environment and sustainability. And I'm realizing that over these last 50 years, since Stockholm, 1972, the conference on human development and the environment, we've had massive reports, many summits, many conferences, loads of books, but the state of the planet is far worse. And now we even have a summit for the future and a pact that does not even include education, which the Stockholm conference did. So we also must seriously, and that's why it's so important that Stephen raises this point so well, we must not just kind of reorient, we must kind of disrupt, because we're not getting anywhere, it seems, and we do not have 50 years more to do this right. So let me end there, Hilligje.
Well, thank you. So already, Stephen, two big questions to you. The first one by Elena: why has education been so slow in responding? And what is where's the change of direction in education? Where can we expect it? And then you, Arjen, are asking this huge question: where does the more radical change come from, or where can we expect it to come? Because that's also one of the calls of much of your work and the work of Stephen as well. So Iveta, your reaction in 5 minutes before we go to the next stage of our conversation.
This is so wonderful, and thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation again. And thank you so much, Stephen, for all of your work over the decades in pushing, despite all of the resistance, for this more transformative role in education. And I kind of got really excited thinking about the metaphors too, now that Arjen was mentioning the keys and the locks and smashing the locks. I also started thinking about how doors inevitably lead to kind of also very maybe predetermined spaces, something that's already architecturally planned and kind of already set and thought through. And I was wondering if there are also pathways that may be less planned and maybe kind of more transgressive, like cracks in the foundations or some other, could be windows or bridges or portals. So kind of maybe less expected places that also then may lead us to maybe less expected solutions, something that may lead us to something that we may have not considered yet, something that may have the potential. Anyways, I would love to talk and play a little bit more with these metaphors and see what they can, how they can help us also think maybe broader and in different ways. But of the 10 locks and keys that Stephen outlined, I wanted to pick up a thread that details the problem of individualism, and both in terms of the dominant education reform emphasis on the individual action and behavior as a point of intervention, which also becomes a deflection from the structural causes of unsustainable lives, but also in terms of the deeper problems that the cultural foundations of Western modernist schooling, including this deeply ingrained logic of human exceptionalism and neoliberal individualism that defines dominant approaches to education. And I have done, so this is more now to build connections with some of the other works that I have done with my colleagues Jeremy Rapley and Hikaru Komatsu, where we began to try to empirically document what philosophers have been doing for years. So conceptualizing culture and looking at it in terms of the connections to environmental and sustainability studies as well. So we have been trying to draw from literature from psychology and philosophy and environmental psychology that define culture as something materialized in the patterns of practices and institutions rather than stable set of beliefs or values stored inside the individuals. So distinguishing between specifically independent versus interdependent selves, how we think about our own selves, independent versus interdependent. So from this perspective, the focus then is on the relationship between self and the other, including ourselves and nature. So, and then the question then is what we do about ecology depends on our idea of the relationships between people and the planet, the people and nature. And also there are some degrees of diversity and difference. Forms of self-construal generally differ from one culture to another. So for example, independent self is very dominant in individualistic societies such as United States or United Kingdom or Australia, whereas interdependent self tends more to be dominant in societies that are more collectively oriented, such as a lot of countries outside of Europe and North America, many indigenous societies. So in our recent analyses, we were trying to look at how these cultural dimensions strongly relate not only with people's environmental attitudes, but also with their actual environmental impacts. And we found that in those countries with strong individualism, the people tended not to accept anthropogenic causes of climate change, and they also tended to have greater environmental impacts on Earth, the actual impacts, the ecological footprint. And so these findings also directly translate into the education policy in practice. So in our recent study, we explored how some of these so-called best practices, such as student-centered learning, for example, may inadvertently promote ontological individualism, or this independent construction of self, which in turn is one potential cause of our inability to move towards sustainability. In particular, so we looked at that countries that are really committed to student-centered learning tend to be dominated by ontological individualism, and at the same time also score much lower on a range of social and environmental sustainability indices, from income inequality to ecological footprint. And moreover, countries where belief in ontological individual is dominant tend to be liberal market economies, which also raises questions about whether such institutional arrangement is detrimental to social and environmental sustainability. So in this sense, so our research shows that as long as the dominant model of modern schooling, at least the way we know it in the West, continues to reify human exceptionalism and neoliberal individualism, it will ultimately propel us further and faster into the ecological catastrophe. So instead, I'd like to invite us into the conversation to rethink existing pedagogical practices from a cultural perspective, inevitably questioning this universality of the so-called best practice approaches as student-centered learning, for example, and reconsider its implications for sustainability. And it's also an invitation to look beyond the Western horizon and become more aware of already existing pedagogies in both Western and non-Western context that constitute alternatives, as highlighted by many colleagues already in some of the discussions here and beyond. And so ultimately, also just maybe one last thought I wanted to say, this re-articulating education in terms of interdependent relationship also must extend beyond the humans and include the Earth's broader ecological community. And to this end, we can radically reconfigure curricula and pedagogies in accordance with more interdependent relational notions of agency that extend beyond the human beings. So this is a cultural shift that I think is also at the core of our survival. And of course, these ideas that are not very new, as I mentioned, so much of it already is practiced in many indigenous cultures. In the science, I just also wanted to mention really quickly in feminist science in the science and technology studies, people like Donna Haraway has been problematizing also these ideas of individualism for so long, basically telling us, well, can we even imagine these concepts of individualism and human exceptionalism may be even unavailable for us to think with. So if those are not around us, how would we restructure our relationships with each other, with the planet? And how would we then, what would that mean for education? Probably very different visions. So I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, time is ticking. Unfortunately, I see that we would need at least 2-3 days to discuss most of the things that we've been hearing. This very important point you raise beyond the one by Elena that I would put as central, why has education been so slow in responding You said much more, but I think that is one of the bigger questions. And then where's the radical change to come from? And then this request for a change of paradigm, as some of the points that were already made by Stephen as well. How do we move from the individual to the interdependent model of people and planet and people amongst themselves? And to complement this, I think we can highlight some of the questions from the question and answer section of the Zoom, where one of the questions asked is, what do we do when in countries there is the whole issue of education itself and provision of educational opportunities is a question in itself, and then what does that mean? And we are just back with some colleagues from the UNESCO Chairs Conference in Addis Ababa, where a lot of emphasis was put also on the non-formal education sector, which is also to be taken on board very seriously, also when it comes to sustainability, where many of the models in very highly educated societies actually move away from a relational dynamics between the human and society, or human and nature itself. And so sustainable development also finds many answers in the non-formal education system. So that's one of the questions to look at. And the other question is one where what do we do with the different education systems that exist, where we have maybe a tendency to believe that the public sector is better equipped to address these issues, and the private sector, especially for profit, less so. And I would argue that the higher education sector, when it comes to private higher education, indeed is much more focused on the individual and less on the societal aspects of education, and due to its very nature, less inclined to engage with SD, but that's a question that you could also pick up. I think that's an important one. And then there's a reference to Chris Brink with this question, and not what are universities good at, but what are they good for? And this is at the heart of many of your interventions, both the presentation by Stephen and your reactions, Arjen, Elena, and Iveta. But what are the impacts of small, meaningful activities and initiatives within higher education? But there are many more other things that are happening. And this would actually relate to the final question about what about more siloed approaches to the SD or a whole of institution or a whole system approach to the transformations that are needed. So I'm very conscious of the fact that we only have 20 minutes left. I would like to get back to you, Stephen, to start and maybe react to the reactions and to the questions that came to the table. But if you could keep it to some 5 to 8 minutes, that would allow to then engage in still a bit of conversation to follow.
Thanks, Hilligje. The first thing I'm going to say is really stupid, because I've just noticed my power is going down. I need to run and get my power lead in a minute. So if I disappear, you'll forgive me for a second. But yeah, what a rich conversation has been stimulated here, and fantastic contributions by everybody, including the comments on the question column. And we're going to run out of time, of course. And I think we're perhaps setting what I find exciting is we're setting not exactly a new agenda, but I think we're taking the agenda on from perhaps where it has been for some time, because there's an urgency. I'm just exercised every time I open a newspaper or I look at the Guardian or something, and there's another report about things going horribly wrong. And I'm thinking, this is really, we need to get a grip and in education. And when education policy and practices make almost no relationship to what's going on in the world, I sort of despair somewhat. I think, well, why is that? And I think that's a question which Elena put forward, and I think she's absolutely right. And if I'm not misquoting Elena, I think if you've got a social context whereby these issues are not explored or critiqued, then it makes it quite difficult for policymakers within education to take a radical stance. And if they take it too far, they'll probably get sanctions put on them in one way or another. So I think, you know, when I joined University of Plymouth years ago, we had I don't want to talk about this too much because the time is short, but we had a mandate, and we actually used the word transform the university towards sustainability, and this was signed off by senior management, and I'm not sure they quite understood what they're signing off really. But we made a distinction. It's possibly not a distinction others would make between these words systemic and systematic, and what we meant by that is the systematic. We use that word to describe all the rules and procedures and structures that constitute a university. So we did what we could to actually change those structures and policies and rules and procedures as far as we could in favor of sustainability. So that was one strategy. The other one is what we call the systemic, which is all the glue and the conversations and the informal stuff that goes on, which is really important. So if you can work on both those fronts at once, I think you can make progress. And certainly we made progress at Plymouth, maybe not as much as we would have liked. But I think using systems ideas, and certainly we looked at systems change theory when we were doing our work. I think it does actually empower people to make the kind of changes which we need. And I'm a great fan of systems thinking, and it doesn't have to be high level. It can be seen quite simply. It's really about understanding relationships and flows and consequences. And I really think getting systems ideas into the way the university is conceived and run, but also in terms of pedagogy and curriculum, all this can actually make quite a significant difference. I mean, the other key part here is that years ago, and it was 25 years ago or something, we began this work, and we never got people surprisingly saying this has nothing to do with me. Why are you doing this? Everybody seemed to understand it in some respect because what's going on in the world. So I think that's even more the case now. So there's increasing numbers of academics, certainly increasing numbers of students, and certainly some policymakers. I think we have to actually change educational thinking and practice for the better. So I think there's an opening up taking place, despite all the blocks or the locks or whatever metaphor we want to use. And I think that's heartening, and I think you can actually build on that kind of energy and the ideas which come out of those kind of energies. And I think collaboration and connectivity and working together, certainly in our universities, universities are like this in silos. We work like this. We're making horizontal connections all the time, and that creates its own buzz and its own momentum. So yeah, I'm actually quite encouraged by, certainly when I did the book research, I was encouraged by the number of initiatives and organizations popping up that didn't exist some years ago. So I think there is a buzz going on, despite the frustrations and the blocks and the difficulties. And you have to hold on to that and use that as a way of encouraging and inspiring others to make the necessary changes. And also, I think a lot of us would be critical of the neoliberal ideology, but that paradigm actually changed what HE was over years. It's actually changed the whole. It's changed the whole way of seeing higher education, and somehow we took that on board, and somehow we need to get rid of it, and to some extent get back to older liberal as opposed to neoliberal values, more humanistic values, but also now ecological values. And I think it's possible. I think the whole society as a whole out there is, as I said in my talk, is in between an old story and a new story, and we have to critique the old story and make the new story happen.
Yeah, thank you very much for these initial reactions. And yes, Iveta hoped that we would still have 40 minutes to go for the conversation. I think we will have a follow-up webinar, definitely, because there are many points that are raised, and I also see Giulia Stagini already informs us that she has to leave, and that we will inform you about the outcomes. The webinar is recorded. We will also have a follow-up write-up on this, and we will share with all those registered for the webinar, and you will be able to find it online. There's a lot of information in the chat as well for many people to pick up, also on the positives, because that was one of the issues that Arjen raised earlier, how to keep the momentum also redirected towards more positive opportunities for people to get engaged, because younger generations also at times say, well, you ruined it all, and now it's for us to clean it up, but where do we see where we can engage? And that's a big conversation that is also to be orchestrated soon. This similar conversation involving many students from different perspectives, also to see what they have to say, but also the teachers and the professors, because they are, to use your metaphor, Iveta, they're the door to this transformation, yet sometimes they're also one of the locks, because they have been educated in a system, they have been taught into their positions with certain expectations that have changed over time. But for change is complex for an individual in general. I would say it is always something that comes with a certain kind of inertia initially. So to move an entire community within a university setting is also complex when you think of all the individual approaches to what they believe is their task in education. So how to help or steer in different directions. I know, Elena, you wanted to say something about higher education, so let me give you the floor quickly,
Sure,
and then also to Arjen and Iveta again, back to Stephen at the end. Yeah.
No, these are such good questions. I wish we could explore all of them, but I think what I was going to say ties in nicely to some of these questions about what is higher education good for, as well as these questions about siloing, fragmentation, systems approaches. So I just wanted to mention if you've had an opportunity to become familiar with the Futures of Education report, or if you haven't, one thing you'll notice is that higher education isn't a standalone chapter. There's not, each level, primary, secondary. There's these thematic aspects about pedagogy, about the role of teachers, about learning societies. And higher education, in fact, is woven into every part of the Futures of Education report, and in a very multifaceted way. And this was something that I think the International Commission on the Futures of Education saw. It's not just, doesn't just serve one function. It's not just a lever in one way, but actually has many aspects. So one is that the mission of education certainly does need renewal for the context that we're in. Many higher education institutions come from legacies of elitism, of colonialism, perhaps. They have within their systemic configurations and arrangements these legacies that need to be reoriented, reimagined. The cultures need to be examined in this way, but also higher education is an extremely powerful mechanism for the mobilization of knowledge and research on all aspects of transformation. And the Futures of Education report describes, for example, its relationship to teacher education programs, its relationship to the configuration of learning environments. So all these different aspects of how we think about education, non-formal education, all these different aspects of education do have a direct link to higher education as well. And if you're familiar with the UNESCO Chairs program, like we were mentioning this recent forum in Addis, you'll see how important it is and how powerful it is when higher education and scholars and research programs break through the sectoral divides and silos and fragmentation that these institutions can often reflect. So that's one thing just to regard. And I also just wanted to comment on this point about the SDGs, and that there are certainly limits to a target-driven framework that I think we're well aware of, but I don't know if we necessarily have to limit the way that we respond to that framework. That we, while the framework itself has within it some silos and silences and missed opportunities, our response can be systemic because we do have these other entry points as well. So those are just two thoughts that I wanted to connect to these excellent questions from the session.
Thank you very much. Yes, the International Association of Universities, one of the partners of UNESCO, not only in the Futures of Education initiative, but all the different steps moving us into the future. We showcase what universities do quite a bit. And so maybe Isabel Toman, who's leading on our work on HESD with me, can add it in. We really have this constellation of universities from around the world making the difference in their own contexts. And they go beyond the siloed approach to education. We've also been invited recently to contribute a publication on the whole of institution approach to sustainable development. And that we hope to test the waters with you as colleagues and many around the world to look at the document before it's finalized. And it allows to answer to one of the questions in the Q&A as well. What is this whole of institution approach to SD that is also required when yes, there is a bit of siloization, but it's the same question as, are there limits to target-driven frameworks? Is it really a limit to have disciplinary approaches to issues that we need to study? Not necessarily. It's very good to have an extensive expertise in the different fields that make up for the higher education landscape, from the social sciences, humanities to mathematics, physics, etc. But then to make these links between the disciplines and work together to identify solutions to issues that we face is essential. Arjen, how would you like to come in on these dynamics?
Well, there's a lot going on here, but I think one question, can higher education or education in general transform the world? Well, with that question has already been answered. In less than 200 years, education and higher education for sure has been able to develop capacities and competencies that have, in the words of David Orr, created more effective vandals of the earth. And this is, if you look at 4.5 billion a year of evolution and all the Earth systems that have been formed in that 4.5 billion of years, and one species is able to change it in less than 100 maybe, that's a remarkable achievement. So there's no doubt in my mind that education is extremely powerful. So what it boils down to is then, what is the moral compass underneath? Is there an ethic of care, of social justice, of equality driving this? Is there a sense of community and solidarity driving it? Or is it something else? And I have a feeling it's something else. And that is, so that's the first question. How are we gonna we critically look at ourselves and the kinds of values we're amplifying and the ones that we are silencing or ignoring? That is a key question about ethics and moral, the moral stance that we take as institutions and as schools. Otherwise, we become complicit to what is happening and actually accelerate unsustainability. If we look, why is it so hard to change? Because we are part of this project. We have created this kind of machine that is very effective in destroying the Earth's resources and widening inequality. So it's something that we helped create. So then to destroy it and to change it is a very big challenge. And it starts, with universities like locally Utrecht University together with ETH Zurich in Switzerland. They decide that they do not want to be ranked anymore as universities. These rankings of courses, of staff, of universities that lead to a culture of accountability, of measurement, of control, of managerial systems that kill education, that kill learning, that kill experimenting and trying things out, because there's no freedom to try and to do bold things anymore. Otherwise, you get penalized, as Stephen or the sanctions will follow, as Stephen was just saying. And this is where I think student movements, young people, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, there's the bold action happening, and that they are not thinking in silos. They are more relational in the way they think. It's head, heart, hands, embodiment, working together with soul, with spirit, and knowledge to bring about real change in communities. And then the question is, where are we as universities? How can we connect with that? And maybe a whole institution or a whole school approach with a moral compass of change and care and solidarity can help a lot. But it does require that we look in the mirror and that we dare ask the uncomfortable questions and dare to become uncomfortable together and name the elephant in the room. And I apologize to the elephants for using that metaphor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very important points here as well. So watch the IAU space soon. We will issue a global statement against ranking together with Utrecht University, ETH, but also with a university in Malaysia, a university in Africa, universities in Latin America. So this is something that will follow on the UNU statement against rankings as well. So there is a lot happening there, also on deconstructing the whole academic career advancement mechanisms or the publication sphere where open science is still not a reality and is one of the locks to the future if we want to change. There was, in that regard, there is a comment from a colleague from, where is he? Many comments here. Where do I find him? Abderrahim from Chenini, from the Vice Rector in charge of external and cooperation at Gardaya University in Algeria, asking about how African higher education engages in sustainable development approaches. There's a lot of work in Africa and whole of Africa being done and piloted out of Rhodes University in particular, but also with ARUA or with the African Association of Universities. Hela Lotz is a name that you can look up, and she's done a lot when it comes to the African engagement with SD. And where you say, Abderrahim, that Gardaya would like to learn from EU universities, we also certainly say we need to learn from African universities. We need to learn from North and South African American universities. We need to learn from the Arab world and Asia, because there's not one solution that will fit any kind of the challenges that we face, and that's absolutely essential. And Arjen's underlined it. Yes, education has been extremely powerful into training people who have gone through a high quality so-called education and higher education system, now are in leading positions and are perfectly equipped to destroy the world. So what can we do to actually address that is the big question that Iveta is invited now to react to quickly. Then I give the floor to you, Stephen. We will go over time 10 minutes because we started a bit late. And then Isabel Toman would also like to show you the outcomes of the Mentimeter just as a closing remark, because we will never close this conversation. We will actually only see this as an extra conversation starter to go even further in the future with you, hopefully. So Iveta.
Thank you so much. So I think I just wanted first to reaffirm that it's a dual task that we have. On the one hand, reflecting on what we as universities have done to the planet, that the way we have used research to justify exploitation of resources and domination of men over nature. And but at the same time also how we can mobilize some of the resources that we have and the ideas for alternatives. And also just maybe give some positive examples. Again, I was a Fulbright scholar in Finland last fall, and I spent some time in Jyväskylä University, and they had the most unbelievable project going on where a group of philosophers wrote the statement on planetary well-being, and then they worked with every single department in the university to write and think about what that means for their particular disciplines. They actually published a book that is available online called Planetary Well-being. It's open access. And then they were taking this book on a tour at the university when I was in Finland. And I happened to be in Jyväskylä University on the day when they were discussing this book in the accounting department. And I have not heard the most fascinating conversations in a long, long time. So to me, it was a really great example of how we can work across the disciplines and kind of really push the boundaries of how we think about our own silo disciplines and how each of our own fields contributed to the problem, but also what we can do about this. So it's just one example. In my own university at Arizona State University, similarly, every single department is now challenged to think, how will we respond to this challenge of planetary crisis and planetary well-being? And it's a difficult exercise, but a really, really important one.
You're very nice. I also recently heard of colleagues in Colombia working a lot on happiness philosophy and how that can relate to positive impact and transformation for the better in order to be better equipped also emotionally to address the challenges that we face. So also a very important dynamics with which we will hopefully also offer a webinar in the near future on happiness philosophy. So it's another way of looking at these things. And I just gave the reference, or I will give the reference. I think I didn't push the button, but here is, I believe, what you were referring to, planetary well-being at Jyväskylä University, a university also very strong in addressing the issues of multidisciplinarity and multilingual approaches in order to foster a brain opportunity to liaise better with different knowledge systems to inform what we have to do when it comes to challenges we face. So other things there as well of interest. Stephen, the closing remarks are for you. I'm sure that Elena, Iveta, and Arjen have much more to say, but time is ticking, and so we will have to close for now, but more to come. Thank you already very much to you as a speaker and to the respondents for your extraordinary inputs and time. Very much valued, as you can see in the chat as well, with people from Nepal to South Africa to Latin America, from all parts of the world taking part. So thank you for your time, commitment, and extraordinary work that you shared with us. So the closing remarks for you, Stephen, and then the Mentimeter. So stay with us for a few more minutes. Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Hilligje, and thanks to everybody who's managed to stay the course and contributed in the chat. And thanks to my fellow panelists whose eloquence is hard to cap, really, but I'll do my best. Yeah, thank you to you all. I think there's I think there's a conversation here which is really important, which we've launched in a way. And I think it's not just us, we're reflecting what's happening on the ground. I get a lot of requests from universities to talk about these issues, and I think there is a sort of growing demand and a growing awareness that whatever a university is doing, it's not quite enough to meet the world as we see it and the world that graduates are coming into. So to give an example of that, a couple of years ago I was involved in a special issue of Frontiers in Sustainability, and I think the title was Repurposing Universities for Sustainable Human Progress. Well, that generated some fantastic contributions. But what's interesting is the last time I looked, it had 164,000 hits and downloads, which is tremendous. To me, that indicates there's a growing hunger for new thinking in this area. Similarly, I was involved in an exercise by the Great Transition Initiative, and I put both these links up, by the way. And what's interesting there is the people who are involved in that, I think maybe half of the people involved in that discussion, that forum, were a little bit dismissive of higher education and thought the whole system is so grounded in the past, it can't possibly cope and can't possibly change. And the other half came up with all kinds of interesting initiatives and developments such as Iveta and and Hilligje explained just now. So there is a lot of innovation and new stuff going on, which you have to take heart from, I think. I'm also just been involved in writing a keynote for the University of Tasmania. For the first time ever, I've been asked to talk about embedding a sustainable systems epistemology in the heart of the university. Well, fantastic. No one's ever asked me to talk about that before. So it's indicating, you know, that there is this kind of wish, if you like, amongst growing numbers of staff and students to look at things differently, given the polycrisis and the systemic issues which are facing us. So yes, we have to be very realistic about the blocks and be critical of those and unpick them and see how we can actually address those, but also being heartened by the positives which and initiatives which are taking place, because I think our case, if you like, our argument is incontrovertible. You know, you have these issues. You have a threatened future for sure. All the science shows that. We have to address that. That's incontrovertible. We have great numbers of students and staff who want to do something differently to address these issues. That's undeniable. We have in my view, a sound philosophy and critique in ecological thinking, which I've tried to work on for years, which I think is which provides a basis for going forward. And in actual fact, I would just mention that the International Commission talked about this emerging ecological paradigm in their report in 2021. Fantastic. I'm glad they mentioned it, but they didn't actually elaborate it. Maybe that's for us to do. You know, maybe that's for us to do to show how that can actually guide us forward. So there's a
fantastic. Yes, thank you so much. Much more to come. There are also other projects. So the Earth Charter was mentioned in the chat. We talked about another initiative that the IAU is very much engaged with, and that's the SOS UK and then global-based Responsible Futures initiative with students to also help define how a university can transition to something different, moving us into the future. So there are many activities. We as an IAU are often called to the table to help entire systems to transform, to invite speakers to speak to all universities in one system. And we've done that around the world, from Turkmenistan to other parts. So it's interesting because there's a real interest in moving us in those directions. And we usually mention the great work of UNESCO, your work from around the world. So these are connecting points and people are picking it up, maybe not to the point where we would like. So Isabel, you have 2 slides for us and the sum up of the Mentimeters. So we're curious to see.
Thanks so much. And yeah, just very briefly, we had very great interventions already, and Stephen has summed it up perfectly. We had here some points where we asked the participants earlier, and 100 people responded, what the challenge are for higher education. And I think we have a too long list, unfortunately, to read them out now. But I think we will share them at the end. I think specifically things that are skills and thinking how we see higher education, and some parts of our discussion are reflected here, but then of course also more in the management and the finance and in the strategy of universities. There's probably a lot of other conversations that we could lead. But what we did want to do in the end, which we don't have time today, but maybe you'll continue thinking about this when you leave this webinar, is potential solutions and actions that we could take to be transformative, to be potentially disruptive, to really change the way we think and we act, to not have a negative impact as higher education stakeholders, but actually contribute to a more sustainable and just future there as well. So I'm just leaving this here. I know that I'm very conscious of time, and I really appreciate that so many people have stayed with us until the end. We will be sharing the slides. We will be sharing the links that were in the chat and the recording. So everyone registered will be receiving an email from Zoom in a day or two with the links, and also on the IAU website you'll be able to find it. So thank you so much, and I think I'll leave it here and Hilligje, let you close this webinar.
Yes, with a thank you note to everyone who have all the people who have contributed very strongly in the chat, in the Q&A, with much information and exchange already, and we hope that this will lead to many more contributions to the great work that needs to be done. After so many years, we need to continue, because there's no end to this. And again, I would like to thank you, Stephen Sterling, for your excellent input presentation, and congratulations on your book, which I hope people will pick up on. Thank you, Iveta, Elena, and Arjen, who had to leave because he was in a totally different setting and had to go back to the work he was undertaking with his teams and teamwork across disciplines, for that matter. Thank you, Isabel, for having facilitated the preparations of this very dynamic webinar, and we look forward to many more conversations in the near future and along the way into the future. Thank you so much.